The geological column contains countless billions upon trillions upon quadrillions of footprints. Well, actually, not the entire column. The very lowest portion of the geological column is utterly devoid of any footprints. But the upper 2/3 of the geological column is absolutely chock full. And it's these footprints that I've called out on multiple episodes of flood geology failures, and that's what we're here for again, another flood geology failure. I've called this out as a serious problem for the young Earth creationist explanation for the origins of all the rock layers. So we've got something a little different today, though. All right, this isn't just me pointing out some problem with the young Earth creationist model. This is a group of young Earth creationists have written an article just published on creation.com, the website of Creation Ministries International, in which these creationists point out a flood geology failure. Yes, a failure of one particular flood geology model, because there's multiple models among young Earth creationists of how to explain the geological column. And these young Earth creationists say that fossil footprints are a problem for other young Earth creationists. Yes, they're pointing out a flood geology failure. Let's see what they have to say coming up next. All right, here we go. Fossilized Animal and Bird Footprints in Mega Sequences by Carl Frode, Jerry Ackridge, and John K. Reed. All right, here we go. The naturalistic stratigraphic concept of sloth sequences, relabeled mega sequences, by several young Earth creationists, had limited technical development in the first few decades following its introduction. We previously evaluated the concept of sloth sequences, the sloth-derived creation mega sequences, but found its application incapable of defending the biblical record of Earth's history. Only recently has a more fully developed presentation of creationist megasequences been published in a book and peer-reviewed journals, from which critical analysis can be offered. Okay, this is all internal language to young Earth creationists in the sense that, all right, young Earth creationists have these models of, one group of young Earth creationists has this model called mega sequences. They have these extremely large, thick layers of sediment that are found across like entire continents. And this to them represents major periods during the global flood in which you had large tsunamis and patterns of sediment distribution over large areas. So they're trying to explain these major groupings of sediments, like major sandstones versus marine layers. And so there's one, and this often goes along with a model called catastrophic plate tectonics, where the plates are all moving around really quick during the flood. So that's when Europe and America is separated, the New World and the Old World, and they're like running away from each other at extraordinary rates and so forth, right? And all that is causing enormous chaos in terms of the waters on the Earth. So everything's sloshing around and creating these large sequences of rocks, right? That's simplistic version of that, but gives you some sense for what's going on here. All right, so these individuals are going to be critical of that particular model, and they have a particular piece of evidence that suggests that this particular model creation, the catastrophic plate tectonics model, is wrong, and that's footprints. That, of course, caught my eye since I've talked a lot about footprints. All right, we applaud the authors for defending the biblical account to demonstrate the flood was global, catastrophic, and of unparalleled destruction. All right, those are our fellow young Earth creationists. They believe the same, they have the same root beliefs in terms of the age of the Earth and the Noah's flood being responsible for the geological column. The significance of days 140 and 150 to the flood were reviewed and explained in graphic terms that are consistent with our own expectations regarding the singular event in Earth's history. In other words, they've looked at the biblical evidence, trying to read the description of the Noahic account and describe and use that to try to understand the different layers of the geological column and place them in terms of like what would have been happening at different points during the flood. Right, the waters are rising and then the waters are receding. So you'd expect more deposition, and then you have erosion happening later, like in very broad terms. Of course, that's about all they can say in terms of like the details of Noah's flood, because there's not a whole lot of other detail there recorded for us in Genesis. But so they have sort of like, what is day one? Well, that's the onset. you'd expect there would be like a break point in the geological column between, you know, sort of like a calm, placid environment, and all of a sudden, you know, you have new sediment and the breakup of the deeps and the huge amounts of rain coming down and so forth. You should have some kind of break point there between the onset of the flood and the flood itself. And then even during the flood, you're going to have, oh, I have a graphic for this. I probably should just go to that. You have the building up of sediments early on, and then eventually the tearing down of them later. Anyway, they're saying, well, we all agree that all air-breathing terrestrial life, including birds outside the ark, died by day 150 of the flood. So the year-long flood, by day 150, they say, we suggest, we think, based on the Noahic account in Genesis, and you also believe this, that all the animals, all the air-breathing animals, all the organisms that Noah was attempting to preserve on the ark, all ones outside the ark would have been dead by day 150. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that actually says that. This is simply an inference that by the time the waters get to their highest point and they begin to recede, I think in their mind, they're thinking if organisms survived past day 150, they would have a chance of surviving because land is going to start appearing after day 150 as you have recession occur. So any of the ones that survived on a log floating raft or something like that could have jumped off on land and could have survived. And therefore, that wouldn't be true. The Bible would not be accurate in saying that all life was wiped out other than that was found on Noah's Ark. So they're picking out this day 150 as like, okay, by day 150, that's it. Like no animal could have survived that long. All right, and you and I agree on this. I'm spending time on this because it's really central to the hypothesis that this group has kind of come up with to test the other group's geological theory, right? Flood geology theory. The geological notes are broad in scope and largely lithostratigraphic with an occasional reference to fossils. For example, although the mixing of vertebrate skeletons and marine fossils was interpreted across two megasequences, missing was an explanation of perhaps the most important set of trace fossils. Right, we're talking about this other model again, right? Not conventional geology. So this is one creationist group talking about another creationist model. And all right, so yeah, you've got like megasequences that are marine megasequence, and you have what looks like terrestrial, even though you have waters covering the whole earth. Like you should expect some mixing between the two. Like there's certain expectations or predictions of that theory. And so they're saying you got some problems there with your megasequence model. But we think one of the biggest problems is this. Missing was an explanation of the most important set of trace fossils, fossilized animal and bird footprints, tracks, and trackways. While floodwater can mix the remains of the animal and marine fossils, rendering them electhinous, not sure if that's the pronunciation, deposits of limited use, the fossilized footprints, trackways of formerly living creatures must be formed in situ. I agree. It's hard to explain how a footprint could be like floating around and get deposited, right? A footprint is the result of there was a foot and it made a print, right? There had to be a foot there to make the footprint. And so it had to be produced in situ. If you see a trackway, an organism is got to be associated with that particular trackway. Now, here's where I can go like, but were you there? I can pull out the Ken Ham line. Were you there? Did you actually see that animal? So what they're telling me is they actually believe in some forms of historical science. They believe they can make an observation and connect it to a modern day observation, which is trackways are made by organisms making tracks, and then infer in the past when they see tracks, there must have been an organism that made those tracks. Right? You didn't actually have to be there. You didn't actually have to see the animal walk across that mud flat and make impressions on it that then got preserved. And you have to watch the preservation process in order to know that an organism made those tracks. See, they agree. I try to point this all the time. The young earth creationists are always accepting the facts of historical science, right? Or the accepted interpretations of historical science, except when they disagree with them. Then all of a sudden, oh, historical science, that you got to stay away from that. How do you know? Were you there? Like if you weren't there and you can't retest it, you can't remake those tracks from the past. Sorry, tangent. Were you there? Right, but I agree. They have to have been made in situ. So billions of tracks represent potentially billions of organisms that are walking around on surfaces somehow in the middle of a global flood where the waters are covering the entire earth. So now the last line of this paragraph is over here on the side. Where these fossil features represent activities associated with past life, they would be important in discerning the formation relative to flood day 150. Why is that? Why is that? Because after day 150, all the land-breathing animals are dead. So if you have a bird or a dinosaur or a mammalian track representing an organism that would have been on Noah's Ark and should have been dead outside the Ark, how could they have made tracks after day 150 if you all agree that all the animals are dead after day 150? It means any portion of the geological column that was laid down after day 150 should be devoid of fossil footprints. And that's what they're arguing. That's what they're going to say. I completely agree with them on this. This is an interesting hypothesis. And they're generating it based on their belief that this is how you interpret the scriptures, that by day 150, all the animals should be dead. You know they couldn't have any of them could have survived the flood, right? You're gleaning that from scripture. And you're simply saying that day 150 is probably that cutoff point. And so if you believe that, this is a hypothesis that you should be looking for evidence to support. And that's what they're doing in this article. I'm going to show you their evidence. But before we get to that, when did they form? Many animal bird life forms could have created footprints, tracks, trackways before the flood. Yeah, okay. Yeah. With the onset of the flood, living animals and birds, footprints, tracks, trackways, would form in soft flood deposits, sediments through day 150. Now, I think this is an outrageous statement because you have massive amounts of sediments being laid down, like massive amounts, like all the way up through the Cretaceous, right? So in some cases, tens of thousands of feet thick layer sediments, which contain multiple layers that have footprints. And somehow they're all laid down very quickly underwater. And yet somehow footprints are being laid down. Now they have this whole model of like tsunamis and waters kind of not covering the entire earth all at one moment, like every point on the earth at one moment. It's more like, it's the water's moving over here, there's some land that appears, and then the water sloshes back over here. And so it's never at a moment other than up to like when you get to day 150, that could be like when the whole earth was covered with water. Like everything's starting to settle down, you still have the water covering everything. And that would be another reason to believe that no animals are alive at that point. But before that, you sort of had the waters rising, and so animals are running around and they're trying to get onto the new land that's forming and potentially putting their footprints down. That's not what this video is about. I've discussed that numerous times and have presented numerous problems with that hypothesis that, yeah, sure, trackways could be found within the early parts of the flood. No, not really. That's not a reasonable inference. We recognize that footprints are possible following the 150th day of the flood, based on dead and bobbing animals drifting prone along a soft sediment substrate, leaving isolated impressions. Okay, so you get that? So after day 150, all the animals are dead. But you know what? Some of those dead bodies are floating on the water. And where the water ends up being very, very shallow, right? You could have those dead bodies and the legs or the dinosaur hanging down into the water. And so they're kind of bobbing back and forth and their feet are kind of touching the floor, right? And they're kind of making impressions there. And so as they make impressions, they're making little footprints on the bottom of on the surface. And then maybe more sand gets deposited on them and they get preserved. And so it's possible for a dead body to make footprints, is what they're saying, right? Now, they acknowledge that's probably not a super likely event. Like it could occur rarely because you'd have hundreds of thousands of bodies potentially. So you have some potential for this. However, and this is a totally appropriate thing for them to say, and we would expect these traces to be few in number. Random in orientation, yes, because these organisms are not like, oh, I'm walking across this land. No, they're dead. They don't have any intention here. And isolated in occurrence, absolutely. Like a print here, a print there, a print over there, not in a straight line, not in a trackway, because you know that there was many of the footprints that we have in the fossil record are in lines, right? Where you have a few feet, dozens of feet, and sometimes hundreds of footprints, right? That represents, and sometimes in pairs, or maybe 5 or 6 organisms all walking next to each other. Those, they would say, you shouldn't expect to find after day 150. Just these random associations. Now, you know what they're going to discover when they start looking at the actual reported evidence of footprints. They're going to find out that throughout the geological, well, from a third up in the geological all the way to the very top, there are footprints and there are trackways, right? Long trackways of birds and dinosaurs. Of course, dinosaurs not all the way to the top, but and mammals, right? And other reptiles. And there's really no stopping that, right? There's no, the entire geological column, all the way up to the very present, is chock full of footprints. That's not an expectation that these creationists say that other creationists should expect to see. Honestly, I don't know how they explain it. They don't really explain it themselves. They're more just pointing out a problem with somebody else's flood geology theory. I think it's a problem for theirs too. Oh, by the way, here is the biblical, Bible-based geological timescale. And really, don't ask me exactly how this is created, other than just the very generic things, right? You got your creation week, and during the creation week, you wouldn't expect, I love this part over here, no fossil footprints and no tracks. Well, yes, before day 4, because there weren't any animals before day 4, there couldn't be any footprints or tracks. Well, unless God just made them, like, and just placed them in the sediments. Right. But so that's telling you that they are using a naturalistic model of expectations. Can't have any footprints before there's actually animals that have feet. All right, then the rest of the creation week, well, there's still things happening in the world, and so potentially an organism that was made on day 6 could actually leave a footprint. It could be preserved in actual creation week material. I have never heard anyone really explain well how you would identify what is a creation week piece of the geological column. And then in the antediluvian or the pre-flood world, of course, you've got lots of animals running around, so they could leave footprints. So that's possible. Now, mind you, Andrew Snelling and others often like to give talks in which they talk about how impossible it is for organisms to leave footprints, and really only a global flood could explain footprints. Because after all, if you walk out, and on a beach and you put footprints down, do you really think they're going to become fossilized? Nah, no. Are they going to preserved? Absolutely not. Except that they do, because we have human footprints preserved in sand. So it does happen once in a while. And go watch some of my other videos, and we kind of do the math on that. The expectation that, yes, you will find footprints. All right, so the antediluvian world. And then you have the beginning of the flood. And they've broken the flood into the lower flood, the middle flood, and the upper flood. Well, the lower flood is really the vast majority of the geological column, because that is when the waters are covering the earth and dissolving lots of rock and sediment that was previously there, and then depositing it. And so by day 150, which they see is coming, after this lower section of the geological column, that's when you have the end of footprints and tracks possible, because after that, you only have dead animals, right? So no tracks. You don't expect any tracks. You don't expect any tracks in there. This is what they're predicting. You shouldn't find any tracks in the middle and upper flood event. Now, there's no dates on this, or like how you would identify what a middle flood is versus late flood. But presumably day 150 is when the water reached its height. All right, that's when it's said to have covered all the mountains. And so that would be the time in which they view like most of the large sediment sequences all being set down. After that, you then have some more deposition, but more of that is because you have erosion from one place and it's depositing elsewhere. So you can still have large amounts of deposition, but it's being shifted around from one place to another. And then eventually you have drainage at the end of the flood, in which you incise a lot of valleys, and you have mountain formation occurring. You have volcanoes maybe occurring and other things. So they're also laying down ash and so forth. So you have a lot of additional deposition of materials. But in the material, you shouldn't be finding any fossil footprints, because after all, Noah hasn't landed yet and released the animals back into the world to repopulate the world. And so there's nothing there to make footprints. So there should be a gap. I think this is a very reasonable inference from their model. There should be a gap in the geological column where there should be footprints, no footprints, and then footprints again. And I would even add to that, in the very initial stages after the flood, there should not be very many footprints because it's going to take a while to repopulate the world. And then eventually there'll be more and more and more footprints over time as there's larger and larger populations, giving more opportunities for those footprints to be preserved. Then you got the Ice Age, and they break that down into different stages. And then you have the present age, all right? So they're kind of like making their own little geological column with their different periods and without age assignments, but nonetheless, different periods of time. So now, here's the other figure from their paper. All right. And this figure, basically, they're using to addly smash the catastrophic plate tectonics model and mega sequence model. Because they're saying that, look, your model says that lots and lots and lots of sediments were laid down in the later parts of the flood. All right. And especially when you go up here to the Cretaceous. You see, like, they're saying, like, what if we even put the Cretaceous, like the top of the Cretaceous, as day 150? All right, that's what this model of Clary and others at ICR, right? Because they have an upper flood, post-flood boundary layer. A lot of creationists have the boundary at the Cretaceous and Tertiary, which means day 150 would be somewhere farther, a little bit farther down, because you'd have to have all the other events that happen after day 150, because you have like another 100 days of the flood going on, actually more than that. And so you're laying down a lot of sediments, and those would all fit within the end of the Cretaceous. So many creationists think that at the end of the Cretaceous, that's when Noah released the animals, and then everything in the Tertiary is repopulation and further catastrophic events during the Ice Age and so forth that ended up preserving more fossils. But in the Clary model, or I'll call it the ICR model, the flood ends way up here, like way up here near the upper end of the Tertiary in the last like 2 million years of conventional geological columns. So just the very tippy top. And so all of this sediment was in the flood. And so if they have day 150 right here, because that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to show that model. They're saying, well, they're saying day 150 would be right around the end of Cretaceous. All right, and that's when like the floods reached the highest level. And then they would say that all this stuff in the Tertiary is still just flood deposits. And only the stuff in the very, very tippy top of the fossil record would represent organisms preserved after the flood. Now, here they're showing, right, tetrapod tracks, bird tracks, dinosaur tracks, mammalian tracks, right? You got your mammal tracks showing up. Actually, this is not quite right, really. You do have some mammal tracks that go all the way back into the Cretaceous. But the majority of mammal tracks are found in the Tertiary. You got your dinosaurs, right? In the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, the dinosaur age. That's where you find dinosaur fossils, but you also find dinosaur footprints. And then you got other tetrapods. So you can have amphibians, you can have reptiles, mammals, anything else that you can't really exactly identify. Oh, you got all those. And so what, of course, they point out? They point out that there's no break. You just keep looking at layers of sediment and you keep finding footprints. Footprint. There's no stop. Right? I think this is a flood geology failure for all flood geology. But they're rightly pointing out that in at least this model of the late geological boundary, that why would we find footprints all the way up and just going right through into the modern age? There should be a point where there's a lack of footprints because all the animals are dead. And yet we don't see that. I think this is a fantastic figure. I think this is a great figure to pull up and ask any young Earth creationist why there's a continuous record of footprints. All right, so what do they say about this? Let's read their words, not just my interpretation of that. The application of stratigraphic megasequences to Bible-based outline of Earth's history should allow formerly living animal bird form footprints, tracks, and trackways to provide an important biomarker. It should be a biomarker to be able to identify where the ending portion of the flood is, where all the sediments laid down when no organisms still exist. Yes, there could be there could be bones in those things because there's dead animals and they're floating around and they're getting deposited. But there should be all of a sudden lots of bones in the fossil record, but there should be a lack of any footprints. Their presence in the stratigraphic rock record should terminate by the end of day 150. The specific mega sequences moving from the oldest to the youngest, Sauk, Tippecanoe, so forth, and Tejas, where this fossil evidence of life was terminated, could then be used globally to stratigraphically approximate day 150 of the flood. Right? We should be able to like approximate in the geological column where day 150 is, because at that point we should stop seeing footprints. Still see bones and other remains of organisms, but the footprints should stop. However, an examination of the animal bird footprints, tracks, trackways defined within the Sloss-derived creationist megasequences creates a puzzling situation, to put it mildly. There's no apparent termination of the fossils, as we would expect based on scripture. It's a great sentence. There's no apparent termination of the fossils as would be expected based on scripture. The opposite seems to be the case. More diversified fossilized animal bird footprints, trackways, and trackways occur in moving up the mega sequence timescale. That's a great observation. Every creationist should read this article and become aware of this and think about this. As you move up the geological column, the diversity of footprints increases. Shouldn't it decrease during the flood? Shouldn't, like, at first you have lots and lots of organisms that are still alive and they're panicked and they're hanging on to floating trees and they're swimming and they find little bits of land and they leave some footprints. But as the global flood rages on, more and more organisms are dying. And there's only going to be a few left, and that should be a select few. Only the best ones can survive in, the ones that were already somewhat adapted to swimming and were the strongest, or maybe float the best, or, whatever. But that should be a subset of all the different organisms that were there at the beginning of the flood. So you should go from pre-flood, which had every single type of organism. So you should have lots of diversity of footprints. Then you should see a reduction in footprint diversity types. Then you should see no footprints. Then you should start to see some footprints again. And then you should see a plethora of footprints, especially since you have speciation occurring. You have all different, more diverse types of feet in some types of birds and mammals. That is not the pattern found in the fossil record. And they're saying that here. They're absolutely saying that here. The opposite seems to be the case. More diversified fossil animal footprints occur moving up the time scale. Based on these fossilized traces, life has continued to increase on Earth from the Kaskaskia megasequence to the Tejas megasequence, which is the present time. We would be interested in understanding how those advocating megasequences would address this issue. Actually, I'd be really interested to see how you address this issue. The authors of this paper address this issue, because sure, you put the post-flood flood boundary in a different place, but that doesn't make a difference. You're admitting that no animals should survive after day 150. You should also be looking for this natural biotic break, right, in the fossil record. We would be interested in this confusing situation with the proliferation of living animal bird footprints, tracks, trackways, and trace fossils created following day 150 is even more pronounced when viewed through the framework of catastrophic plate tectonics. Actually, in a sense, they are admitting that this is a problem for all of us, but it's an especially big problem for those of the catastrophic plate tectonic persuasion. So how do we move forward? What are we going to do about this? The fossil record of animal bird footprint tracks, trackways created by formerly living creatures does not fit the Sloss-derived creationist megasequence model. They extend from the Kaskaskia megasequence to the present. These living creatures somehow left footprints in flood deposits as evidence of their survival. They are found well past the megasequence defined day 150 termination of all terrestrial life as conveyed by scripture. I mean, here they're tying this to scripture. This problem occurs because the megasequences are inexorably linked to the naturalistic geological timescale. Oh, I see. Because the mega sequences are tied to the names that conventional geologists give to different portions of the geological column. That's why this problem happens. No, the problem happens because there's a continual record of fossil footprints, of preserved footprints throughout the geological column. That's why there's a problem. It doesn't matter what names you slap on these things, the footprints are there, and you showed it, right? You have a figure that shows that there are footprints in all these different layers. The only way we can believe, the only way we believe that creationist megasequences can be properly applied stratigraphically is if young Earth creationists abandon the naturalistic geological timescale for one aligned with the biblical narrative. Well, I showed you that one aligned with the biblical narrative. We got this early, middle, and late period. What are they? Where are they identified in the geology? You haven't tied that to any, like, here's a location on Earth where there's the early, there's the middle, and there's the late. Right? All it is a thing on paper. At least the conventional model is tied to actual rocks, which you can actually go and observe. You could disagree about where they put those breakpoints and say that this, you know, the Ordovician starts here, and I can recognize the same layers of rock somewhere else. You could disagree that those are the same rocks and that really should be called the Ordovician, but at least somebody has actually tried to tie them to reality. We hope the problems we have identified can simply and easily be addressed by the advocates of creation megasequences in a way that more consistently defends the biblical account of Earth's history. We look forward to their response and resolution. I don't know what's your model. I honestly, I've read Reed's stuff and so forth. I don't understand how he thinks that this can be explained or how it's really any different. So there they are side by side again, the two figures from this paper. There's your biblically based geological timescale. And all these folks have, all these other young Earth creationists have to do apparently is drop the whole Triassic, Cretaceous, Jurassic, you know, the names on the conventional geological column and start going over here and using the biblical geological timescale. And then somehow that's going to solve the problem of footprints. I mean, they brought up the problem. The problem is the continuance of fossil footprints throughout the geological column. I don't care how you squish that into the biblical one. Those footprints are still going to exist, right? You're still going to have footprints. They're saying we don't expect footprints here. Well, show me where those rocks are. Right? Show me on the Earth where those rocks are in the upper and middle flood event. The stuff that was deposited during that. And then let's test it and see if there's footprints there. I don't think that I think these authors know there's going to be footprints there. So maybe they should say that day 150 is way up here and there wasn't anything deposited after day 150. I don't know what they could do. But this whole idea of like squish it into the biblical based geological timescale, I don't know what the biblical based geological timescale looks like on Earth. I know these, I understand these categories. Creation week, there's a time between the creation week and the flood. Then there's a flood. The flood did something, right? Changed the landscape. And then after the flood, there's an ice age, which was a fairly significant event. We can see effects that it's had on the landscape and geography of the Earth. And then there is the present age since the ice age, and we see changes in the Earth and deposition of materials in some places and erosion in other places there, right? But you need to tie that to, okay, a particular location, here's all the sediment for 10,000 feet. Now let's knock it off. Which layers belong to which portions of this biblical timescale? I really felt kind of vindicated when I read this article because I've written multiple articles about footprints and the challenge of footprints to young Earth creationist flood geology models. Multiple times. I've made multiple videos about this. And here, Reed and others are pointing out that this is a serious problem, right? We have a missing footprint problem. We should be missing footprints, and we're not, right? We accept footprints exist because real organisms made footprints. And if real organisms made footprints, they were really alive. All right. In their article, they admit, yes, okay, maybe a dead organism could make one footprint, but a dead organism doesn't make a trackway, right? Which we can follow for hundreds of steps, right? And we have bird trackways, we've got alligator trackways, we've got dinosaur trackways, we have synapsid trackways. All right, remember synapsids are the non-reptilian mammal-like organisms, right? They're not dinosaurs or other reptiles. They're not mammals. They're synapsids, right? And there's thousands of species of those that existed. And this whole idea, I can't help but reiterate this whole thing of, because this article really made me think about it in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. That's what I actually like about the creationist literature. It makes me think. You know, I've learned more by having to think through my own expectations of what I would expect to see. And what this article made me do is actually just go back and think about, well, yeah, what would be the pattern of fossil footprints in a biblical framework? And so it's just what I presented. You'd have none, then you'd have like the total diversity of footprints laid down in pre-flood sediments. Some creationists might argue there's not a lot of pre-flood sediments, but nonetheless, if wherever there are pre-flood sediments, if they are able to identify them, they should predict. I'm going to help them with their predictions, right? Here's the hypothesis, and here's the prediction. There should be a lot of diversity of footprints in that pre-flood layers. All right. Should be birds, reptiles, amphibians, synapsids, right? There should be multiple different types of all those in that pre-flood sediment. And then the onset of the flood, okay, yes, there could still be potentially, I think it would be really difficult to explain how you get footprints during this flood, in which the windows of heaven open up and the earth cracks open and water is gushing forth, right? In a very violent event. How you get footprints preserved so quickly that way. Nonetheless, if we grant that there would be some in the flood record at all, they would be found near the base of the flood record, right? And there would be more diversity there, and there'd be less and less and less and less and less because more organisms are dying and dying and dying and dying. There's fewer organisms to make footprints. And then at some point, no footprints. Like they're gone. Like you have multiple different layers of. So when they're all dead, there shouldn't be any more fossil footprints, and yet you have more sediments. Some of those sediments are laid down as higher land is eroding now, as eroding and being deposited in lower areas. I bet there's footprints in those layers, right? That would be post 150 days. And then there's some point where the flood is, there's some day in which Noah lands, and you look out across the earth, there shouldn't be any animals. There should be no animals making footprints anywhere. And yet there's lots of things happening on Earth. There's got to be, for one thing, there's lots of erosion going on because there isn't like forest, right? So there's lots of rain, stuff's eroding, it's being deposited, lakes are filling up. I mean, just all kinds of stuff is happening, right? So there's lots of opportunities to make footprints, but no animals to make them. And so therefore there should be sediment layers which are just completely devoid of any evidence of footprints. And yet footprints are found, right? In so many different areas of the earth, right? By the billions. And so then after Noah's animals leave and depart, then there should be an increasing number of footprints being found and an increasing amount of diversity of footprints found in different parts of the world. This is distinctly not the pattern of the geological column, of the fossil record. So, if that's the expectation, young Earth creationists need to come up with another hypothesis. How can you explain the actual observations? Right? How do you explain the actual observed footprints that are found in different locations? All right. Hey, that was this was a fun article for me to think about and talk about, and I'm going to be really interested to see if Reed and friends actually answer this and respond to it and try to explain fossil footprints. I will be intrigued with their answer, and when they do answer, I will certainly talk about it here. Hey, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.